It began in the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. Warm string lights swaying overhead, shadows stretching across a lawn where voices tangled with the smell of smoked meat. Faces smiled, but not at me. Every laugh seemed to have a quiet edge, every gesture a reminder of where they believed I belonged. I sat where they placed me, hands still, eyes steady, letting the evening write its own script. They didn't see it, but the turn had already been set in motion long before the first drink was poured. By the time they understood, it would be far too late to undo. Before I take you there, tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed in that chair? And where are you hearing this from right now? Drop in the comments and make sure you like and subscribe because the moment it all changes is coming. I had been to enough family gatherings to know that the warmth in people's smiles often hid colder truths. But this year's barbecue felt different from the moment I stepped into Tyler's backyard. The place was bustling with the smells of grilled meat, the sound of clinking glasses, and the easy laughter of people who felt they belonged. I'm Walter Price, 68 years old, with silver hair cropped short and a body that still holds the shape of the man I was, though time has curved my back slightly. My clothes were simple, khaki pants and a worn button-up shirt, but clean and pressed. I knew they would see only the surface, not the life behind it. Across the yard, the family photo booth dominated the lawn, a tent-like structure draped in white cloth with fairy lights twinkling against the late afternoon sun. A hand-painted sign read, "Family Memories," in looping gold letters, and the space was buzzing with chatter as cousins, siblings, and in-laws arranged themselves for their turn. I thought it would be nice to step into a shot, maybe even get a copy for my living room wall, something to remind me of better days. As I made my way toward the booth, the photographer, a young girl Tyler had hired for the event, glanced at me with a polite smile, but before I could step inside, Tyler intercepted me. He stood square in front of the opening, his grin practiced and just sharp enough to cut. "Only for the main group," he said, his tone casual, as though he was simply stating a fact. Then, with a quick flick of his wrist, he pulled the curtain closed. The soft fabric swayed for a moment before settling, shutting me out entirely. Behind it, I could hear laughter and the rapid click of the camera shutter, but it sounded different now, like a door slammed in my face. I stood there for a heartbeat longer than I should have, then stepped back and turned away without a word. There was no point in asking questions. I already knew the answer. I drifted toward the tables where Madison was holding court, her shiny new portable printer humming as it spat out photo after perfect photo. She handed them out with the flourish of someone bestowing rare treasures. Each print was rich with color and detail, the kind of image people would frame or post online. I lingered at the edge of the group until she noticed me. "Oh, here you go," she said, slipping a single photo onto the table in front of me. I picked it up and my stomach tightened. The background was sharp enough to make out every leaf in the hedge behind me. But my face was blurred, my features smudged, as if I had been moving too fast, or as if I wasn't meant to be captured clearly at all. Madison tilted her head, letting her eyes linger on the print before looking at me with that same sly smile she used when she wanted everyone else in earshot to hear her. "Guess the machine couldn't recognize old faces," she remarked. The cousins standing nearby chuckled, trying and failing to hide their amusement. I laid the photo back down without responding. In that moment, it wasn't worth my breath. The truth was, I'd been in enough situations like this to know that people reveal more of themselves when you let them believe they've gotten away with something. I took a slow breath and glanced around. The grill smoked steadily in the corner. The younger kids darted between chairs, and the main group was now shuffling out of the booth, their laughter ringing in the air. They looked at their prints with wide smiles, posing again for candid shots that Madison snapped with her phone. Every movement Every shared joke was a subtle reminder of where the lines had been drawn and where I stood. I walked to a chair in the far corner of the yard, under the sprawling shade of an oak tree. From there, I could see the entire gathering without having to push my way into any of it. The air was warm, almost heavy, but under the tree it felt cooler, more distant. I watched them for a while, thinking how strange it was that blood ties could feel weaker than string. The photographer waved over another cluster of relatives, arranging them with practiced hands. They laughed easily, pressing shoulders together, and I wondered if any of them realized how staged it all was, not just the photos, but the whole performance of being family. I figured it was time to join in, maybe grab a plate before the good food was gone. As I approached the rows of chairs, I noticed something odd. There were two distinct clusters. The first was a tight circle of cushioned patio chairs arranged close to the grill, their seats angled toward each other, so conversation would flow easily. That circle was already filling with the so-called main group, the ones who ran the conversations, planned the events, and seemed to think of themselves as the board of directors for our family. The second cluster was a haphazard ring of old folding chairs, mismatched and wobbly, pushed out toward the side fence, right next to two giant trash bins. The smell of barbecue mingled with the sour tang of garbage. I didn't need a sign to know which circle I was supposed to belong to. I slowed my steps as I neared the cushioned seats, but before I could even pretend to look for a spot there, Madison's voice sliced through the air. "Uncle Walter, we saved you a seat over here." She gestured toward the folding chair closest to the bins, the one with peeling paint on the armrests. It wasn't an invitation, it was an instruction. I forced a polite nod and made my way over, sitting down carefully as the chair wobbled under my weight. From this angle, I could see everyone in the VIP circle laughing and leaning toward each other, passing plates without ever needing to raise their voices. In our outer ring, conversations came in scraps, shouted over the clatter of the grill and the occasional slam of the trash bin lid when someone tossed in a paper plate. I settled into silence, taking in the details. Every time I glanced toward the grill, someone's eyes flicked away quickly, like they didn't want to be caught watching me. It was the same calculated avoidance I'd seen earlier at the photo booth. They didn't want me in the center of anything, only on the edges. Halfway through a round of polite, surface-level chat about the weather, my nephews gathered in a small knot just a few feet from me, passing around something small and glossy. I caught a flash of bold letters, top 10 lowest paying jobs. Their laughter bubbled up, unrestrained, and one of them held the card at just the right angle for me to read the list. There it was, my former trade, listed at number 3. I'd spent 40 years in that job, building homes from the foundation up, shaping wood and steel into places where families could grow. To them, it was just a punchline. One nephew elbowed another, muttering something about how it explains the truck. I drove, and the group erupted in another round of snickers. I didn't bother defending myself. Experience had taught me that arguments in moments like this were wasted breath. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for a reaction. I gave them none. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, the metal frame creaking beneath me, and let my gaze drift over to the cushioned circle. Tyler was there, his head thrown back in laughter at some story Dennis was telling, his hand wrapped around a frosty drink. Madison, perched on the edge of her seat, tossed her hair and leaned in to whisper something that made the whole circle laugh. It struck me then how orchestrated this was. The physical distance between the two circles was no accident. It was a deliberate placement, a way to signal status without saying a word. I had been assigned my place, and everyone there knew it. The thing about being placed on the outside, though, is that you get a clear view of the center. I could see every smug smile, every whispered comment, every subtle glance pass between them. They thought they were hidden in their little ring of comfort, but to me, they were on full display. One of the kids from the VIP circle wandered over to the trash bins to throw away a napkin. He gave me a half smile, the kind children give when they're imitating the condescension they've seen from adults. "Hi, Uncle Walter," he said, before running back to the cushioned chairs as if afraid to linger too long in my orbit. I watched him go, the weight of it settling in my chest. They were teaching the next generation the same unspoken rules. The sky was darkening now, the fairy lights around the photo booth starting to glow against the dusk. The music shifted to something softer, but the laughter from the inner circle only grew louder. My nephews had abandoned the novelty card, but the smirks lingered on their faces, the private joke still hanging between them like smoke. I took a sip from my cup, the ice half melted, and reminded myself that the night was still young. Whoever gets the closest wins a drink ticket. I wasn't paying much attention until I saw Dennis's eyes land on me from across the VIP circle. He stood up, all grins and loud confidence, and walked toward me with a swagger that was just shy of a smirk. "Walter, mind if I borrow this?" he asked, already reaching for my wrist before I could answer. He unclasped my old watch, a gift from my late wife that had kept perfect time for over 30 years, and held it high for everyone to see. "All right, folks, next item up for bids," he shouted, turning slowly so everyone could get a good look. I could hear a ripple of laughter pass through the group before he even finished the sentence. The watch wasn't flashy. It didn't have gold trim or designer brand stamped on the face. It was simple, sturdy, and reliable, the kind of thing a man wears because it does its job well. But that wasn't what they saw. I'm thinking fast food meal deal. Maybe a burger, fries, and a drink if you got a coupon, Dennis said, and the roar of laughter that followed made my skin prickle. He passed the watch to Tyler, who turned it over in his hands like he was inspecting a relic from another century. "Yeah, maybe thrift store shelf, $2 tops," Tyler added, tossing it back to Dennis with a grin. My seat near the trash bins suddenly felt like a fitting stage for this little show. I didn't move, didn't reach for the watch, just sat there and let them think they'd had their fun. Eventually, Dennis handed it back to me, still chuckling as he walked away. I put it on without a word, fastening the clasp the same way I had thousands of times before, the weight of it against my skin grounding me in a way their noise couldn't touch. I thought that would be the end of it, but apparently, the evening's entertainment had just begun. A few minutes later, one of my nephews, Cole, came up behind me and plucked my old canvas hat off my head. It was a bit faded from years of sun, the brim bent to fit my hand's habit of tugging it down against the glare. Before I could take it back, he carried it to the center of the lawn, holding it up like a trophy. "Ladies and gentlemen, the auction is now open," Cole announced, and a crowd gathered around, clapping and shouting fake bids. "I'll start the bidding at 10 cents, someone yelled from the VIP circle, and the laughter began again. Madison upped it to 15 cents, holding her drink in one hand and waving the other like she was at a real auction. Dennis, still riding the wave from the watch joke, grinned and shouted, 25 cents, and that's my final offer." Cole slammed his hand on the table like a gavel, declaring Dennis the winner. The crowd cheered, and Dennis took the hat with a mock bow, placing it on his head backward like some kind of prize. The laughter rolled on, and I felt the air between us thicken with the unspoken truth. They weren't just playing games. This was about sending a message. I was the punchline, and everything I owned was fair game for ridicule. I could have gotten angry, could have stood up and snatched the hat back, but that would have been giving them what they wanted, a reaction they could spin into another joke. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms, watching Dennis parade around in my hat like a clown performing for a circus. In that moment, I started cataloging every face, every smirk, every whispered side comment. I was storing it all away, knowing there would come a time when remembering these small humiliations would serve me well. The game moved on to other items. Expensive sunglasses, a fancy watch from Tyler's collection, a designer handbag Madison had bought on her last trip, but none of those drew the same kind of cruel amusement as my things had. For the rest of the round, I stayed quiet, my expression neutral, giving nothing away. Around me, the outer circle clapped politely and laughed when it was expected, but I could feel their sideways glances, the unspoken acknowledgement that I was being singled out. Some of them might have even felt sorry for me, though none would say so out loud. When the game finally ended and people started milling toward the buffet tables, Dennis tossed my hat onto the table next to me without a word. I picked it up, brushed off a few crumbs, and set it back on my head, adjusting the brim until it sat just right. The laughter from the earlier jokes still hung faintly in the air, but I let it pass over me. The circle of chairs shifted so everyone could gather around while Tyler took the center seat, grinning as Madison stood beside him like the master of ceremonies. She began passing him the gifts one by one, reading aloud who they were from before he tore into the paper. Each time a new item was revealed, an expensive grilling set, a sleek smartwatch, a gift card for a weekend getaway. The crowd reacted with cheers and exaggerated wows. When Tyler was halfway through, Madison reached in her tote bag and pulled out a small clipboard with a sheet of paper clipped to it. Her voice rose just enough to cut through the noise. "If you haven't pitched in for the group gift yet, make sure you sign the list," she announced, smiling sweetly before walking directly to where I sat in the outer ring. Without a word, she placed the clipboard and a pen on the table in front of me, holding my gaze for half a second longer than necessary. The moment was quick, but it was sharp enough to slice. I knew exactly what she was doing, making sure that everyone who hadn't noticed I hadn't contributed yet would notice now. I let my eyes drop to the list. Half the names had neat check marks next to them. The rest had little dollar amounts scribbled in the margin. Mine was still blank. I set the pen down without touching it, sliding the clipboard slightly to the side. Madison didn't pick it up right away, just left it there like an accusation. Tyler, oblivious or pretending to be, moved on to the next gift while I sat still, the weight of the pen's unspoken demand resting between us. Once the last present was opened and the table was cluttered with shredded wrapping paper, conversation began to branch off into smaller groups. I stayed in my seat, sipping from my cup, when I overheard the group in the VIP circle pivoting to their next favorite topic, vacations. Madison gushed about the cruise she and Tyler were planning for next spring, describing the private balcony suite and the champagne reception that would be waiting when they boarded. Dennis chimed in about a golf trip to Florida he had booked with a few friends, rattling off the names of exclusive resorts like he was reciting a grocery list. A younger cousin talked about her upcoming trip to Italy, waving her phone to show photos of the villas she planned to stay in. Then, almost as if on cue, someone in the group, a man whose name I barely remembered but whose smirk I would not forget, said, "Well, of course, not everyone can afford to just pick up and go like that." His eyes locked on me, holding there for a second too long before he turned back to the others with a little shrug, as if to say, "You know what I mean." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it carried the same weight as the jeers from earlier games. It was quieter now, more insidious, the kind that slips under your skin and stays there. I leaned back in my chair, letting the brim of my hat cast a shadow over my face. I could have reminded them that I'd traveled plenty in my life, more than some of them ever would, or that my reasons for not going on cruises had nothing to do with my wallet. But I said nothing. The silence was deliberate now, a choice I was making over and over again as the evening wore on. Every time they prodded, mocked, or excluded me, they thought they were reinforcing their story about who I was. What they didn't see was that I was building a ledger of every slight, every smirk, every calculated dig. And this ledger wasn't for keeping score, it was for cashing in later. The dusk deepened into night, the fairy lights overhead casting a soft glow over the yard. The smell of grilled meat was giving way to the sugary scent of the birthday cake that had just been brought out, Tyler leaning over to blow out the candles while Madison recorded the whole thing on her phone. The cheers were loud and unrestrained. The same voices that had mocked me earlier now belting out the chorus of Happy Birthday, as if they were all in perfect harmony. I clapped along from my seat, the sound of my hands measured and steady. Nobody noticed that my smile didn't reach my eyes. When the cake was sliced and passed around, a piece never made it to my table. I didn't ask for one. Two long tables had been set up side by side under the string lights. One was covered in a linen cloth, its place settings neat and uniform with real silverware, glass drinkware, and neatly folded cloth napkins. That table was already filling with the same faces that had occupied the VIP circle earlier, and I didn't even need to be told its unspoken name, the contributors' table. The second table was bare except for paper plates and mismatched plastic cups, its folding legs uneven so that every time someone cut into their meat, the table wobbled. This was the free riders' table, though no one said the words aloud. They didn't have to. I was waved toward a seat halfway down the length of the bare table, next to a couple of distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Across the short divide, I could see the contributors' table laughing as bottles of imported wine were opened, the corks popping in sharp contrast to the hiss of soda cans on our side. When the food was brought out, the servers, family members in name, waitstaff in practice, delivered the choicest cuts to the contributors first. Thick, juicy slabs of ribs glistened under the lights as they were placed in front of them, the plates looking like magazine spreads. By the time the serving trays reached our table, the meat was mostly bone, the corn cobs shriveled at the ends, and the salad was reduced to wilted leaves clinging to the bottom of the bowl. I ate slowly, watching the other table toast to each other's generosity as if they had single-handedly funded the event. The chatter at our table was quieter, the laughter less frequent, but from time to time, the sharp edges of conversation from across the way would carry over. Halfway through the meal, Dennis stood from his seat at the contributors' table and made a point of holding up a manila folder. He tapped it against his palm until the surrounding chatter dimmed, then pulled out a stack of papers. "Just close on the new place," he said, his voice carrying easily over the tables. He fanned the pages like they were playing cards, flashing glimpses of numbers and bank letterheads. "Biggest investment I've ever made. Feels good to know I can handle it." Madison leaned in for a better look, murmuring something I couldn't hear, and Dennis laughed, turning his attention toward me. "You know, Walter, I bet it'd take you 10 years to save for just 1 month's payment," he said, his grin wide and performative. Laughter erupted at the contributors' table, the kind of laughter that comes from a shared punchline everyone believes is harmless because they've all agreed to laugh. The words themselves didn't sting as much as the way they were delivered, loud enough for the entire yard to hear, timed perfectly so that every eye turned to see how I'd react. I didn't look away. I kept my gaze fixed on him for a beat longer than was comfortable, long enough for him to shift slightly on his feet before turning back to his audience. My fork scraped against the paper plate as I took another bite, the sound small but deliberate, a reminder to myself to keep steady. Dennis tucked his paperwork back in a folder and returned to his seat, the conversation at his table flowing back to talk of interest rates and renovation plans. Our table stayed mostly silent, the clinking of plastic cutlery and the crinkle of paper napkins filling the space where conversation should have been. I glanced down the length of our table and caught a few sympathetic looks, but they vanished quickly when I met them. No one wanted to risk drawing the wrong kind of attention. Across from me, A cousin I barely knew took a long sip from a plastic cup and muttered something about how people love to show off when they're trying to hide something. I didn't respond, but I stored the comment away along with everything else. The contributors' table finished their plates faster, not because they were hungrier, but because they were eager to get back to their seats near the grill and photo booth, back where the night's real social currency was traded. When the dessert trays came out, they were first offered to the contributors, the portions generous and plated with care. Our table got smaller slices and the kind of uneven plating that said, "Be grateful you got anything at all." I ate my portion without complaint, even though the pie was lukewarm and the crust crumbled under my fork. I wasn't here for the food or the comfort. I was here to see this hierarchy in all its pettiness, to watch them build their fragile sense of superiority one small act at a time, oblivious to the fact that every act was another nail in the coffin of their own self-image. The night air had cooled by the time the plates were cleared. The contributors' table lingered, their conversation turning to stories about mutual investments and shared ventures, their laughter carrying over the yard like a chorus of self-approval. Our table began to thin out, people drifting toward the edges of the yard or slipping into the house to check their phones. I stayed put, watching the other table like a man studying a blueprint. I could see the cracks already, the tiny fault lines that would eventually give way if pressed hard enough. Dennis leaned back in his chair, his voice still rising above the rest as he recounted some business deal from years ago, his hands gesturing wide as if to remind everyone just how expansive his influence was. Tyler nodded along, clearly enjoying the performance. Madison laughed at every cue, her eyes occasionally flicking my way as if to check that I was still in my place. I was, for now. But the thing about sitting at the free riders table is that it gives you a perfect vantage point. You can see who's really talking, who's just nodding along, who's holding the conversation together, and who's dead weight in their own circle. I saw all of it. I noted every detail. Chairs were rearranged again, and predictably the contributors formed a neat semicircle closest to Tyler, while the rest of us were pushed toward the edges. I didn't move from my folding chair. It was already placed far enough back to make me feel like an observer more than a participant. Tyler explained the rules. Questions would cover family history, past events, and fun facts, and points would be tallied just for bragging rights. I listened as the first few questions were read aloud. Who hosted the 2018 Thanksgiving? Which cousin broke their arm during the 2012 camping trip? What color was the bridesmaid dress at Madison's wedding? The questions flowed easily, laughter filling the yard as people called out answers. But I noticed a pattern almost immediately. Every single question was about events from the last 20 years. There were no questions from the decades before, the ones I had lived through, the ones I could have answered without hesitation. It was like the era I had been part of didn't exist in their version of family history. When I needed a tiebreaker, Tyler even joked, "We can't go too far back," or "Some people might need a history book," and his eyes flicked in my direction just long enough for the crowd to catch it and chuckle. I sat still, my hands folded over my knee, letting them have their game. But each skipped year, each ignored milestone from before their time, was another quiet erasure, another way of saying I didn't matter in the present because my stories belonged to a past they didn't care to remember. The final round was underway when a voice cut through the air from the free riders table. It was one of the younger grandchildren, barely in their teens, holding a half-empty soda can and a look of innocent mischief that told me they'd been listening to the adults long enough to copy their tone. "Hey, Uncle Walter, do you even have a credit card?" The yard went quiet for half a second before I answered. "No, I don't like owing money." I kept my voice even, but the moment the words left my mouth, the silence broke into laughter. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from hearing something genuinely funny. It was sharper, laced with disbelief and superiority. The contributors' table roared the loudest, some of them shaking their heads as if I had just confessed to living without electricity. Madison leaned toward Dennis, whispering something behind her hand, and they both laughed harder, their eyes darting toward me like I was the punchline they couldn't resist. The younger ones, taking their cue from the older ones, joined in without even knowing why they were laughing. It was an easy target, mocking the man who didn't keep up with their version of modern life, whose refusal to live on borrowed money was seen as proof of being out of touch instead of a deliberate choice. I could have told them stories about friends who drowned in debt, about the sleepless nights it caused, about the satisfaction of knowing that everything I owned was truly mine. But this wasn't a crowd interested in lessons. They wanted spectacle. So I gave them nothing. No explanation, no defense, just the calm of someone who knew that time would do the explaining for him. The trivia game wrapped up with Tyler declaring the contributors' table the winners. Handing them a cheap plastic trophy he pulled from a bag as if it were a priceless award. They posed for a photo with it, the flash catching on their smug smiles. Someone suggested the losers clean up the snack table, and I caught Madison's eyes flick toward me again, that same calculated glance that carried the unspoken command, stay in your place. I did for now, but as I watched them celebrate a win in a game they'd rigged from the start, I could feel the weight of the day's insults stacking higher, forming something solid in my mind. Every slight was another brick, and soon enough, that wall they were building to keep me out would become the platform I'd stand on to look them straight in the eye. The yard was cooler now, the string lights swaying gently in the evening breeze, casting soft shadows across the tables. The contributors clustered around the grill, plates in hand for a second helping of whatever was left, while the rest of us picked through the scraps. I noticed my watch catching the light as I reached for a bread roll, the same watch they'd mocked earlier, and it reminded me again why I wasn't rushing to leave. They had treated my way of living as a relic, my presence as a placeholder, and my silence as consent. What they didn't know was that silence can be the deepest form of patience, and patience, when paired with preparation, can be the sharpest blade in the drawer. As the last round of drinks was poured for the contributors' table and the free riders quietly nursed the bottom inch of soda cans, I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes scanning the yard one more time. Every light strung between the trees, every crumpled napkin on the grass, every faint smell of smoke from the grill seemed to hang in suspension for a moment as I reached into my shirt pocket. My fingers closed around the familiar weight I had been carrying all day, the feel of thick paper edges pressing into my fingertips. I pulled out the stack of envelopes, thicker than any invitation they had ever received, and set them on the table in front of me with a slow, deliberate movement. Even the folding chair beneath me seemed to still, as if it knew the tone of the evening was about to change. The envelopes were cream-colored, each one bearing a name written in neat, precise handwriting. Tyler, Madison, Dennis. Every sibling, every cousin, every aunt and uncle who was here tonight had one. The sight of the stack was enough to draw the first curious glance from across the tables. A few heads tilted slightly. A murmur started low and rolled through the outer circle before reaching the contributors, who craned their necks to see what I was doing. I didn't rush. I let them look. I let them wonder why the man they had labeled as broke, outdated, and irrelevant was carrying something that looked so official. Then I stood, not quickly, but with the kind of calm that makes people pay attention without understanding why. The conversations in both circles softened. The laughter tapered into a curious hush, and I could feel the first flicker of unease slide through the crowd. I rested my hand lightly on the envelopes and spoke in a voice that carried just enough to reach the edges of the yard without shouting. I've been working on a personal project for a long time, I said, my gaze moving across the faces that had smirked and sneered all day. And I think tonight is as good a time as any to share a little joy with everyone. I didn't elaborate, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing what was inside yet. I picked up the first envelope, looked at the name written on it, and handed it directly to its owner. Tyler's eyes flicked down to the neat script, his fingers running along the sealed flap as if weighing whether to open it now or wait. I moved to the next. Madison, then Dennis, then the others, each one receiving their own envelope with the same deliberate gesture. I could feel the shift happening as I went along. Their eyes weren't mocking anymore. They were calculating, scanning the weight of the paper, the formality of the presentation. People who had barely acknowledged me earlier were now leaning forward in their seats, the eagerness to open their envelope barely contained. I could almost hear the mental gears turning. Was this an invitation, a letter, a legal notice? Was a bill, a joke, a gift? Each possibility flickered in their expressions, a rapid cycle of hope, suspicion, and greed. I didn't sit back down when the last envelope left my hand. I stayed standing, letting the tension stretch. You can open them now if you want, I said simply, my voice steady, my eyes holding theirs. Tyler broke the seal first, sliding out the thick check tucked inside. His face changed in an instant, the corners of his mouth faltering before he could hide it. Madison's hand flew to her mouth when she saw hers, and Dennis froze mid-breath, his fingers tightening around the paper as if he wasn't sure it was real. Around the yard, the same scene played out, gasps, widened eyes, the subtle straightening of posture that comes when people realize they've miscalculated entirely. The checks weren't small. Each one was written for an amount that would clear their entire mortgage balance, every last cent of debt they owed on their homes. Some of them glanced at each other, as if seeking confirmation that they weren't imagining it. Others stared at me like they were seeing me for the first time. The ones in the outer circle looked at their envelopes with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, while those at the contributors' table, my loudest critics of the evening, seemed caught between excitement and something heavier, something closer to shame. I let the silence hang just a beat longer, watching them shift in their seats, the sound of paper rustling like dry leaves in a sudden wind. I told you I wanted to share some joy, I said at last. And I mean it, but joy comes with choices. My words weren't sharp, but they carried weight, the kind that settles deep and stays there. I didn't spell out the condition yet. That was for the next turn in the night, but the seed was planted. The realization was dawning in their eyes that whatever image they had of me, whatever place they thought I belonged in the family's unspoken hierarchy, had just been rewritten. I could feel the power shift, subtle but irreversible. The tables, the chairs, the games, the whispers, all of it seemed smaller now, like props in a play whose script I had just torn in half. They had spent the entire day defining me by what they thought I lacked. In a matter of minutes, I had shown them that the only thing they had been right about was that they didn't know me at all. Tyler stared at the numbers in front of him, his thumb brushing over the ink as if expecting it to smudge, while Madison sat rigid in her chair, the envelope resting in her lap like she was afraid to touch it again. Dennis kept glancing from the check to me and back again, the weight of realization pulling at the corners of his mouth until the grin he'd worn all night was gone completely. Those at the outer circle looked stunned, as though the invisible wall separating them from the contributors' table had suddenly evaporated and left them standing in the same space. For the first time all evening, the division between VIP and free rider wasn't clear, and that uncertainty made them uneasy. I waited until I saw their shoulders tense, until I could feel the shift in the air like the seconds before a summer storm breaks. Then I stood again, slow enough that every head turned without needing to be asked. My chair creaked as I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the faces that had smirked at me in the photo booth line, in the chair assignments, in the games designed to make me the butt of every joke. When I spoke, my voice was steady, low, but it carried across the yard like it was being pulled there by gravity itself. "You've spent today measuring me by your yardstick," I said, "deciding where I fit in your little order of things, how far from your table I should sit, how much I'm worth compared to you. You've told me in every way that matters what you think of me. And that's fine. I've let you because I wanted to see exactly how far you'd go when you thought I had nothing to give back." I let my gaze settle on Tyler, then Madison, then Dennis, holding each of them long enough to make them shift in their seats. "But now," I continued, tapping the edge of the closest envelope with my finger, "you have a decision to make. And it's not about the money. It's about what that money says. It's about whether you value this family for what it should be or for the price tag you've been putting on me all these years." No one moved. The fairy lights above flickered slightly in the breeze, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across the yard, wrapping around the tables like a slow, deliberate grip. I saw Madison's lips part as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Dennis leaned back in his chair, one hand gripping the check so tightly that the paper bent inwards, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. I stepped closer to the contributors' table, close enough to see the fine tremor in Tyler's hand as he folded and unfolded his check. "Before you cash that, before you even think about what it can buy you, you need to decide something," I said. "If you take this, it means you've chosen to stand with me as family, not just in the moments where you can get something, not just when you think I fit the image you want to show off, but all the time. And if you can't do that, if you can't put respect ahead of convenience, then put the envelope back on the table right now, and we'll leave it at that." There was a pause long enough that the only sound was the faint clink of ice shifting in a glass. Eyes darted from one person to another as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. I could see the calculation behind their silence, the hunger for what was written on that paper warring with the sting of what I'd just said. Madison was the first to look away, her eyes dropping to her lap, as if the grass there had suddenly become fascinating. A cousin in the outer circle swallowed hard, glancing down at his own envelope with something like guilt. Dennis's leg bounced under the table, but his check stayed in his hand, his knuckles pale. "Family isn't a stage you set for appearances," I said into the quiet. "It's not a game where you get to pick the winning team based on who you think is worth your time. It's something you live every day, even when it doesn't make you look good. And today, you've all shown me exactly where you stand." I stepped back slightly, giving them space, but not letting them slip away from the weight of my words. One by one, their gazes found mine again, some defiant, some ashamed, some hollow with the recognition that they couldn't undo the things they'd done just because a check had changed the stakes. A breeze passed through, ruffling the edges of the envelopes still on the table, as if the night itself was urging them to choose. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said finally. "I'm asking for honesty. If you take this, take it because you're willing to be more than what you've been. If you can't, then walk away with your pride intact and let the rest of us move on." I turned and went back to my seat in the outer ring, the same chair they'd assigned me hours earlier, the same spot they thought was beneath them. Sitting there felt different now. I wasn't the man on the edge of their gathering anymore. I was the one they were all watching, waiting on, measuring themselves against. And for the first time all night, I didn't feel like I was outside anything. I was at the center, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Around the yard, the murmurs started up again, low and uneasy. Some clutched their envelopes tighter. Others set them down in front of them like a burden they weren't ready to carry. Her face flushed deep crimson, the kind of heat that starts in the chest and crawls up the neck, and without a single word, she shoved her chair back, so hard the legs scraped against the patio concrete, with a screech that made people flinch. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the murmurs, leaving a gap of silence as she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels striking the ground in quick, angry beats. She didn't look at anyone, didn't even try to mask the fury in her stride. The fairy lights overhead swayed in the breeze, their glow casting jagged shadows that danced across the empty space where she had been sitting, and her absence landed heavier than her presence ever had. People whispered to each other, some glancing toward me, others toward the direction she had gone, but no one made a move to follow her. That was telling. Her power here had always depended on the assumption that people would stand behind her. Tonight, that assumption was gone. Dennis shifted in his seat like a man suddenly aware of the spotlight on him. His fingers tightened around the check until the paper bowed, and he tried, he tried, to muster the same easy grin he'd been flashing all night. But smiles that are built for show don't survive under pressure, and his faltered almost immediately. He looked down at the amount written in my handwriting, and I could see the moment the number clicked in his mind, the moment he realized that the mortgage on the house he'd been so eager to flaunt was now gone because of me. The house that had been his badge of superiority, the stage on which he'd performed his wealth, was no longer something he could hold over anyone's head. It was mine to erase, and I had done it without asking his permission. His hands trembled slightly, the check rattling between his fingers, and I wondered if he even realized how visible that shake was to everyone around him. I didn't look away. I let him see that I saw, and I didn't soften it. Around the table, others were watching him too, and in their eyes I saw the beginnings of a shift. They were measuring him differently now, seeing the fragility under the swagger. Tyler, for once, wasn't smiling. He sat back in his chair, one hand resting on his check, his gaze moving between me and Dennis as if he were recalculating a math problem that had just been proven wrong. The easy, loud atmosphere of earlier had drained away, replaced by a heavy awareness that things had tilted, and that tilt wasn't going back. Dennis cleared his throat, the sound rough and out of place in the stillness, and muttered something about needing a drink. But when he reached for his glass, the ice clinked louder than it should have, betraying the small tremor still running through him. Across the yard, in the dim light near the grill, Madison's empty seat sat like a hole in the fabric of the evening, a reminder of the first one to walk away rather than face what was in front of her. The rest stayed seated, caught between greed and pride, between wanting what I'd given them and resenting the fact that it had come from me. I could feel their conflict like heat rising from the ground, and I knew it would only grow the longer they sat with it. The night air carried the faint scent of charcoal and cooling meat, the remnants of the meal now forgotten. No one was talking about the food anymore. No one was making jokes. The very people who had spent the day filling the space with noise now seemed wary of their own voices. Dennis looked at me again, and this time the bravado was gone. There was something almost pleading in his eyes, a silent question about what I wanted from him in return for the check. I didn't answer it. Not yet. He needed to sit with the truth for a while longer, to feel the edges of it pressing on him. Tyler cleared his throat, maybe to break the tension, maybe to reclaim a sliver of control, but whatever he had been about to say died on his lips when I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on the table, my gaze steady and unblinking. Nobody here was going to steer this moment away from what it was. This was the point where the balance of the entire night crystallized into something they would all remember. The moment when the roles they'd been playing no longer fit, when the script they'd written for me was ripped out of their hands. Madison's absence wasn't just a walkout. It was a crack in the wall that had held their hierarchy together. For a long moment after Madison's chair scraped away into the dark, no one moved, as if her departure had frozen the air itself. Dennis still sat rigid, his fingers curled tightly around the check like it might dissolve if he let go, his gaze flicking between me and the table as though the polished wood could offer him an answer he couldn't find in himself. The rest of them avoided looking directly at me, their eyes darting between each other in silent exchanges that spoke of calculations, second guesses, and the uncomfortable weight of being seen without the masks they had worn all evening. The fairy lights above swayed in the night breeze, casting shifting patterns over faces that now seemed far older than they had at the start of the day, as if the hours had wrung out the pretense and left only what was raw and real. I stayed seated in the same folding chair they had assigned me at the start, its metal frame creaking faintly as I leaned back, the brim of my hat shading my eyes. I didn't need to speak again. I'd already said what mattered, and the silence that followed was telling its own story. Then, slowly it began. At first it was just one, a cousin from the outer circle, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He stood, the legs of his chair scraping softly, and stepped toward me. Without a word, he laid his envelope on the table in front of me, his eyes meeting mine only briefly before dropping to the ground. There was no hostility in the gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement that he couldn't take what I was offering and still live with a mirror I had held up to him tonight. A few moments later, another followed, an uncle who had kept mostly silent throughout the day, perhaps thinking his silence excused him from complicity. He, too, placed his envelope in front of me and walked back to his seat without looking around. One by one, others followed, not many, but enough to shift the energy in the yard even further. The sound of the envelopes landing on the table was soft, but carried more weight than any of the jabs or jokes I had endured earlier. It was the sound of pride choosing to walk away from opportunity, of people deciding that what they would have to face in themselves was too costly to be balanced by a number on a piece of paper. Those who kept their checks did so with a newfound restraint, their hands holding the envelopes carefully as if the paper might burn if they gripped too tightly. They didn't meet my eyes, but they didn't need to. Their posture, their stillness, the way they leaned back slightly in their chairs all told me they understood the trade they had just made. They had chosen to take the money, but they also knew they had accepted the terms I had laid out, terms that could not be unspoken or ignored. Dennis stayed seated, his check still in his hand, his expression caught between defiance and something that looked suspiciously like regret. Tyler cleared his throat again, but the words never came. Whatever speech he had been preparing seemed to dissolve in the air between us. The yard was quieter now, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but is instead thick with a residue of things said and done that can't be taken back. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound sharp against the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I glanced at the stack of returned envelopes in front of me, the names on them written in my own handwriting, and I felt no satisfaction in their return, only the understanding that this night had been about more than money from the beginning. It had been about truth, about the kind of truth that strips away the layers of status, performance, and pride until all that's left is the question of who you are when the scales are balanced and there's nowhere to hide. The rest of the evening passed in subdued movements, people refilling their drinks without laughter, conversations kept to a murmur, eyes avoiding mine only to flick back when they thought I wouldn't notice. Those who had returned their envelopes sat a little straighter, as if holding on to something that couldn't be bought. Those who kept them stayed quieter than before, perhaps wondering if they had given up something intangible in exchange for a number with a dollar sign. No one made a show of leaving, but the yard slowly thinned, chairs scraping softly against the concrete as groups drifted away into the night. When Dennis finally stood, his handshake was firm but brief, his eyes not quite steady, his good night carrying the weight of things unspoken. Tyler simply nodded once, the check still in his pocket, before turning toward the house. Madison didn't return, her absence as sharp in its statement as her departure had been. By the time the last car pulled away and the fairy lights hummed quietly over the empty yard, I was still in my folding chair, the returned envelopes stacked neatly at my side. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. I had walked into this day prepared to let them reveal themselves, and they had done so in full color. What I had given tonight, whether they accepted it or not, wasn't just the clearing of debts, but the clearing of illusions. No one here would ever again be able to look at me and see only the man they thought they could belittle without consequence. Whether they kept their checks or handed them back, they had all been given the same thing, a truth they couldn't return. As I stood to leave, the quiet of the yard pressed close, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of extinguished charcoal. I tipped my hat toward the empty tables, the same way I would to an audience after the final act, because in a way, that's what this had been, a performance, but not the one they expected. They had written me into the role of the broke old man, and I had let them play it out to the very end before handing them a script they couldn't change. They would live with that ending, each in their own way, but the story from here was no longer mine to write. I walked to my truck, my boots crunching softly on the gravel, the returned envelopes under my arm. I didn't look back. The end. Before I go, I want to thank you for sticking with me through this story. If you've been listening all the way from the moment I walked into that backyard to the last envelope returned, you know this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about showing that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. I'd like to hear what you think. Did the ending land the way you expected? Would you have taken the check or given it back? And where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments so I can see how far this story's traveled. If you want more stories like this, real moments where the tables turn in ways no one sees coming, make sure you like this video and subscribe. Every story I share has a piece of truth in it, and if you've been through something similar, you know how good it feels to finally have the upper hand. Your support keeps these stories going, and your voice in the comments makes them matter even more.